everyone. Whoever's coming on, let me retweet this. Great. Hi. I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to log in because it is only 6:59. So, hello. And we are in my bedroom right now. We're in my bed. I felt this might be the best place to have this conversation today. Let me know if you guys have any issues hearing this broadcast. I have everything on the loudest, so I know sometimes there's issues with the volume on here, but great. Awesome. Okay. Let's see. So I actually have my laptop with me right now. I have my laptop with me because I have a lot of notes, a lot of things that I want to say during this Periscope, and I wanted to make sure that it was clear and not rambling. So let me start with, for those of you who are joining us who have never joined or watched one of our Periscopes before, please leave your questions to the end. I will have some time for questions, and so I'm very open to questions, but please leave it to the end. For those of you who have joined us before, if you do see people kind of popping in, in the middle of this broadcast, if you guys can help out by letting them know to keep their questions to the end, that would be really helpful. That's a little command from your mistress. So I wanted to talk about what this broadcast is going to be about before I jump right into it. So this series of interviews that we're going to be doing for the year actually came about in a certain way. So Dee and I were planning our Periscope for the year, and we discussed the intersection of healing and BDSM, which is very important to both Dee and I. And when we were talking about this, because we have so much interest and enthusiasm, we wanted to cover a few things with healing and BDSM, because we know it's a very large and broad topic. So we wanted to talk about the healing capabilities of BDSM through our Periscope platform. And how we wanted to do that is that we wanted to dive a little deeper by allowing people to talk and speak about and tell their story of their own healing journey through BDSM, as well as interview some people who specifically work with healing practices using BDSM in some formality, in some form, which will be some of the interviews coming up, it really started with one of the interviews we did recently this year, talking to Jesse, who is a therapist, and his collective and what they do, which you guys can see in a past interview. So I'm actually, I guess, starting off this healing journey as my personal story. We'll be having more throughout the year, but we thought it would be good if I started this series and talk about my own journey. And so that is what we'll be doing today, and that's what I will be speaking about today. Again, before we start, please keep questions to the end, and I am totally happy to answer questions that are, of course, said respectfully. So I wanted to, so you're going to see me look over because I'm having a few notes to help, make this conversation a little bit more clear and not all over the place. So I wanted to start by defining psychological trauma. It's a type of damage to the mind that occurs as a result of a distressing event. Trauma is often the result of an overwhelming amount of stress that exceeds one's ability to cope or integrate the emotions involved with that experience. Trauma may result from a single distressing experience or reoccurring events of being overwhelmed that can be precipitated in weeks, years, or even decades as the person struggles to cope with the immediate circumstances, eventually leading to serious long-term negative consequences. So in that kind of vein of description of what psychological trauma, that's what I'm going to be talking about within my story and how BDSM has helped me through that. So I wanted to kind of start with the basics of how I grew up, just to get it out of the way. Some information that's important about me. And so the basics of how I grew up was, I grew up pretty poor. My mother is an immigrant woman she came here during the Vietnam War. And so she didn't speak English very well. And during that time, she was raising 2 kids basically on her own. So she was a single mother, and we moved around constantly depending on her work. She was also very traditionally Vietnamese. And I'm saying this in the past tense because my mom has changed a lot and evolved a lot over the years. So when I grew up in a very traditionally Vietnamese household. And what that means was, first, I grew up in sort of a community type environment where I was being taken care of by my aunts, my uncles, by family friends. When people had to work, they sort of dropped all the kids off in one area, and you sort of took care of yourself as well, but that's usually how it worked. My grandma as well, we'd get dropped off at my grandma's house very often. And then disciplining, when you're raised in a Vietnamese household, discipline is usually done physically. And so this was very normal for me, that if you misbehaved, if you messed up, if whatever ways you got in trouble, you would be physically disciplined. And it wasn't, for at least in my household and what I've known from other Vietnamese households, that discipline usually wasn't just like a spank on the butt. It was some pretty deep forms of kind of corporal punishment that I actually use to this day on my subs and slaves, actually. I do want to be really, really clear that those aspects of my past are not necessarily my trauma. Growing up poor was very positive for me because it really taught me a lot about having a strong worth ethic, valuing, just the sense of value. And so I don't see that as part of my trauma. I also don't see growing up with a single mother as part of my trauma either. It was, it wasn't anything for me, to be honest. It was like I had a very strong mother who, just happened to be a single mother, and so that's not part of my trauma, and I'll talk about what part of my family structure added to that. And then growing up with these very traditional values and being disciplined, I don't necessarily see it as part of a traumatic experience for me because I wasn't the only one being disciplined this way. There's a thing in Vietnamese called Gui, which means when you're in trouble, you're on your knees in front of a wall on wood floor and you get whacked on your butt. But you're there in front of this wall for about, a very long time, depending on how long, how bad you were. But I was usually there with my cousins and my sisters, so all of us were always getting in trouble the same way. So I think a big part of being disciplined in a way that everybody else was being disciplined didn't make it part of my trauma because this was just how we were culturally raised, because our family came to the United States from Vietnam because of the Vietnam War. So we still had a lot of those, you know, that was part of our culture. So what I would describe as part of my trauma was, family-wise, I would say, so my mother and father separated when I was maybe 5. And I would say that was a traumatic experience for me because there was no conversation. It was sort of a lot of arguing, a lot of just my father kind of disappearing, and then he just wasn't there one day. And I was very young with that. And I think for me, that was part of my trauma, was having this, you know, family network being broken, right? And then through that, if I separate, you know, some aspects between, some experiences between my family that I would consider part of, you know, my past trauma, would be, you know, I would say my father and my mother, who separately had, you know, their pros and cons. So I have a very good relationship with my mother now, but it took us a long time to get there, and it took both of us evolving in different ways. But my mother, you know, I think through her past, so I think this is trauma being passed down, she had a lot of rage, and I knew this was going to happen throughout this conversation. I hope you guys bear with me, but, you know, she had her own trauma, and she had a lot of rage from her past, and, you know, that's something that she initially brought onto us in raising her kids, but it's something that I've forgiven her for through the fact that she's grown and I've grown. And so, but as a child, that caused a part of my trauma, having this mother who had a lot of rage because she was going through her own trauma and didn't know how to cope with it. And her coping was, you know, was to put her anger and her rage onto her children. And, you know, through her anger, which was physical, through verbal abuse, and through controlling manners of me not being able to, you know, go to a school dance or leave the house or do any of those things. You know, there was a lot of control that was placed in my household. And I had a father who wasn't there for most of my life. But when we finally connected, he was someone who, you know, how he coped with his problems and his trauma was through drug use. And I had to support him through a good portion, you know, of that, without knowing that he was coping through his trauma with drug use. And when I started to realize that at an older age, that my father was lying to me about his drug use and that I was supporting him financially through that, you know, that was an ongoing issue I had with my father. And so all of this has kind of added to, you know, past trauma and ongoing trauma that I've had with my family. Then, you know, and I kind of just want to couple all these experiences together, all these things that I consider my past trauma together, so that I can talk about sort of the journey I went through to heal those things. I've had a lot of death in my life. I lost my best friend and the first person I ever loved at a very young age, at 16. And I would say that was one of those most traumatic events that I ever went through, because losing someone that close at a very young age, there's really very little ways of coping with losing someone, because you can't talk to them. You can't say the things you want to say to them. You can't anything. And it's just done, right? And after that, I end up losing 2 very good friends, very close after that. So there was a lot of death that surrounded me as well, that kind of caused me to fall apart in many different ways. And then just looking back at a few other things, something I had buried for a very long time was my sexual trauma. At a very young age, through friends of my father, through, my mother's boyfriends at the time, I went through a lot of sexual abuse. A lot of sexual abuse that I buried for a very long time. And, it took a long time to finally, actually emerge and realize these things had happened to me. And because of these main traumas that went throughout my life, there were symptoms, right? Symptoms that you go through that I was experiencing. As a child, I ripped out my hair to the point that I had to have mitts put over my hands so that I wouldn't continue to rip out my hair, and they didn't know why I was doing it. And it wasn't until later on in life that, going through school for psychology, I learned that is sort of a symptom of children who have been abused, something that they might do. And I remember clearly ripping out the back of my hair because I felt like something was wrong with the follicle. I would touch it and it would seem off, so I'd pull it out to the point that I had a very large bald spot. I suffered and have continued to suffer from insomnia. I was extremely depressed. I was extremely angry. I was self-destructive. I was into heavy drug use, especially after I lost especially when I lost my best friend. I spent a good 2 years just in a deeply drug haze. I had a lot of self-harm. I was a cutter. I had a suicide attempt that left me in the hospital. And I continued to get into abusive relationships. And so these were all symptoms of my trauma. These are all things that I did because of all the past trauma that I was going in while these things were happening was the ongoing trauma I was going through, and reliving my trauma by getting into these abusive relationships because the abuse felt safe. It felt normal. It felt familiar. And I didn't have a lot of self-worth, so I felt like that's what I deserved. I felt like I deserved to be in these horrible relationships and to be treated this way. To relive out my sexual trauma with current partners. To not feel like I had control of my body and my sexuality and really anything. And, through some of these things, a big part of this trauma, I had issues understanding what sex, love, and power was. I intertwined them so much that I used sex as a form of power, and control. I used sex as a way to get someone to love me, to forgive me if something bad happened, whether I wanted to have sex or not. I, would use emotional manipulation with those I was in relationships with to, play out abusive scenarios. I would, test people's love for me by just breaking them in any possible way. And then when they would break, I would say, of course, you don't love me enough to be with me. And these were all these abusive cycles that I was in through a lot of the trauma I went through as a child and as an adolescent, that I was also continuing into my adulthood as well. And, there was a point when, I also want to say that, there was a point that when I ended up in the hospital another time, I realized that I couldn't continue this way. And I actually was forced to go into therapy because of that. And I started to work on my trauma, right? So part of my healing journey came from the fact that I was working and coping with my trauma in these positive ways. I was going to therapy. I was studying Buddhism philosophy and mindfulness. I was reading a lot about suffering. I was reading a lot from one of my favorite authors, Thich Nhat Hanh. I was doing some work for my own self-care and for myself. And part of that journey kind of led me to BDSM. So because I was, a big part of my healing journey while I was going to therapy and doing all this reading, through BDSM and sex work, it really solidified a lot of things for me. The self-work I was already doing helped me be open and ready for the next part. So when I actually met a lover who introduced me to BDSM, I was ready for it because I was on this journey of figuring out myself and finding a better place for myself. And when I met him and he introduced me to BDSM, it started off very just sexual in nature first, and it really piqued my interest. It was something that I was curious about. It was thrilling. I was never fearful of it, and when we participated in it, I felt a sense of, and it was initially just sexual, but I felt a sense of peace in it. And I didn't really know what that was because I hadn't experienced it in that way. I hadn't experienced it in the way of knowing those words yet. And so after meeting him, and after randomly meeting a few other people and having these other encounters, it sparked my interest to look into what a dominatrix was, or a professional dominatrix was, and BDSM. So it wasn't until I actually started pro-doming that I actually had the right vocabulary to talk about BDSM and to understand what BDSM was for me. And of course, as a good Asian student, I did all my research. I did, all my research. I did my studying. And I started to really dive into this world of BDSM in a way that was more than just a sexual encounter. That was more than just work for me. It started off as work because I think I needed that excuse to explore this area. I needed the sort of Asian practical excuse of, well, you're making money, so what you're doing is not that bad. But it was actually something deeper that was driving me to explore kink and BDSM through pro-doming. I think it was a part of me that, you know, I knew was there, that I needed aspects of this world that I didn't understand at the time, you know? All I understood was that it was interesting and that I was making money, and that's all at the moment. So as I started pro-doming, I realized that, you know, I started realizing that pro-doming and sex work was this journey I was going on to help understand myself better. I started to learn how to communicate with myself and others. It helped me communicate my interests. It helped me communicate my boundaries. Because I was working with others to help them communicate their interests and boundaries, I was learning those skills for myself. I was learning to let people know in my personal life know what I wanted and know what I liked, because I was having sex at a very young age, at 13, but I hadn't had an orgasm until I was in my 20s. For me, sex was about control and power and anger and everything but my own pleasure. And through communicating and learning and helping my subs and clients learn how to communicate, I learned how to communicate myself. I learned to talk to myself and ask myself what I loved and what I was interested in, what was my pleasure. As well as I learned to talk about my boundaries and what I wasn't okay with and what I didn't want, and communicate that with my partners. You know, I learned about, you know, I found a safe place for control, because so much of my life felt so out of control. I learned what control could be in a positive way. I learned how, you know, through interactions with men, through pro-doming, I learned how to deal with control, to find control, to yield it in a way that was positive for both me and the other person. Because I didn't want to put, you know, I never wanted to hurt somebody else in a way that I got hurt, that, like, because of the boundaries of maybe pro-doming through the business element of, like, you know, that I couldn't just take out all this anger onto my clients, you know, that I had to have control in a better form, that I had to take care of my clients and my subs in a scene, not only for practical reasons, but for, you know, for emotional and ethical reasons. It helped me find control in a more positive way. Instead of, I went from not having control to doing everything I could to grasp control, to the point of just choking my relationships and choking myself, where everything had to be so controlled, so particular, so in line, that I was suffocating myself in other relationships, you know. And so I, like, swung on the other side. But with BDSM and pro-doming, it helped me balance that. It helped me bring control back into a place of letting my clients and submissive know that they have control, because they're here to they have control by communicating their interests and their boundaries. And I have control because I'm being given that control by my submissives and by my clients. And here is a positive way to yield it, right? I learned I had such anger issues. You know, my way of dealing with a lot of my trauma was through anger. And, you know, aggression towards others, aggression towards myself. I was just extremely angry. And after pro-doming, I became less angry. I think a big part of me becoming less angry was that I was allowed to be aggressive in a place that others appreciated. I was allowed to, you know, use my aggression in a positive way, and with people who enjoyed it. And I, you know, because I didn't want to take out my aggression on my clients, it required me to check my aggression. It required me to look at my aggression and see where it was coming from and actually analyze it and deal with it, so that I didn't bring it into a scene, that I wasn't being unprofessional and bringing it into a scene and taking it out on someone. You know, it kind of forced me to have to check this anger that I had no place to put it. And that was, you know, over the years, it just calmed me even more, to the point where everyone in my life was noticing it. Everyone, my sister, the first thing she said was, "You seem less angry." And I think it was also because I finally found people who got me and who I connected with, that didn't judge, you know, that didn't judge these parts of me that I could not change about me, you know, whether it's always a part of me, or whether my interests, who I am was due to my trauma. It didn't matter, because this is who I am now, right? And to be able to be around people who didn't judge me and appreciated and actually enjoyed it was, you know, the anger just went away. The anger just started to fade. And I just found myself being more at peace as the years have gone by through BDSM and through pro-doming. You know, I learned to value myself so much because there were subs who valued me, you know, who valued me as an individual, who valued me as a woman, who valued me as a dominant, who valued just every aspect of myself. They valued and worshipped me and helped me learn to truly value myself. And that, you know, was very hard, you know, to learn my own value and what I brought to the table. I learned to have boundaries, you know, from helping people figure out their boundaries. I learned to figure out my own boundaries and have a safe place to express those boundaries. And even when my boundaries were being crossed while I was pro-doming, it taught me how to express when my boundaries were being crossed. And I wasn't learning that in any other aspects of my life. You know, BDSM was, you know, a big part of BDSM is talking about your boundaries, talking about your limits, talking about your interests, and giving consent in every form. And so I was finally giving myself consent to talk about my own boundaries and to vocalize my own boundaries. And I was bringing that
and that type of conversation into my personal life, into my personal relationships, of saying like, this is what I need and this is what I don't want, and to stop having interactions that I wasn't consenting to, that I was having interactions that I thought I was supposed to. And BDSM taught me to be okay with having boundaries and limits and expressing it. A big part of what I learned and what I have learned and am continuing to learn through BDSM and pro-doming has been just, sexual acceptance. That for a long time I thought I was asexual, and there's nothing wrong if you are asexual, but for a really long time I thought I was asexual because I lacked this interest in conventional sexual interactions, right? I would enjoy them for a limited time, and then I just wasn't interested. And it wasn't until kink and BDSM and pro-doming did I realize that my sexual interests were not entwined with the conventional, that they were entwined differently. They were more entwined with the power dynamics that I had with a partner, certain kinky interactions, and I finally felt like a sexual being after years of participating and understanding and learning about BDSM and kink, and through my pro-doming, I'm more sexually open and understand myself more sexually than I've ever have, because there is a community of people who don't define themselves in the traditional, sexual terms and interest, and that sort of acceptance that I saw from others was the acceptance I needed to see to have that with myself. A big part of my sexuality is my sadism, and whether that is because of my trauma, whether that's because of who I am, I don't know. And the reality is it doesn't matter, right? Because those things happen to me and I can't change them. But what I do know is that I identify as being a sadist. I'm not the sadist who enjoys inflicting pain without the other person enjoying it in some capacity. I don't want to just randomly inflict pain on someone that is not of interest, but is a big part of who I am and my identity and my sexuality. And that's accepted and celebrated in the BDSM community. It's, there are masochists out there who crave it themselves, and it makes for an amazing union for, and it doesn't matter anymore how we got there. It doesn't matter that I had all this trauma and maybe that's why I'm a sadist, because I can't change those things. So I'd rather, have someone, appreciate who I am with all my cracks and with all my damages than try to change this thing that I can't change. I learned how to do power dynamics in a more healthy way because through all the trauma I went through, the one thing I understood was these power dynamics that were being played out, you know, these power dynamics that were happening using, you know, sex and using control and using anger and using all this stuff. And the idea of power dynamics were, you know, we're all jumbled up and messed up, and I was using, you know, power and sex and all of that in these very unhealthy ways. And I learned how to engage in positive power dynamics. I learned how to engage in it in a safer way, in a more clear, communicative way, in a positive way where both parties were aware and gaining something from it. And we're consenting to that power dynamic in play compared to it being underhanded and compared to it being used for all these other things that was happening in my past. I learned to engage in these power dynamics in a way that was uplifting and not destructive. You know, and there's been, you know, as I still go through this journey, I'm still going through this journey with kink and BDSM and healing my trauma. I realized one of the best things that's ever happened to me was that I decided to go with my curiosity. I decided to take a step into the world of BDSM, and I got the opportunity to, and I've continued to have the opportunity to see how kink and BDSM and my interactions with my subs, my slaves, my clients have continued to help me grow as an individual and move past my trauma, and helping others move through their trauma and help them use BDSM in that way has been even more beautiful and more profound for me, to see it kind of come in this full circle, to show people the healing capabilities of BDSM, to help guide them through that, because I've used it, I'm in it, I'm continuing to be in it, I've been in it, and I've done that for myself. And, you know, I know this conversation has this story has been kind of all over the place, but it's sort of been all over the place because it's had such a profound effect, and it's had so many effects on different parts of my life that I'm still discovering, and I'm still figuring out, and I'm still trying to figure out the words for. You know, at this point of pro-doming and being in the BDSM world for almost 10 years, you know, this is what I've discovered for myself, that I've never been happier than I am now, and I know that I will continue to be happier because I am the truest form of who I am, and I have a community that supports that. You know, in the BDSM community, in the sex work community, you know, it wasn't for me just BDSM that helped me. You know, it was also sex work. It was being a sex worker that helped me learn so much about myself as well. And those for me go really hand in hand. And I hope to figure out more and be able to talk about my journey even more. Because I'm still discovering a lot of aspects that, you know, I'm surprised by every day about my journey and, you know, the people I interact with within this community. I do want to kind of ask anybody if they have any questions. I'm totally open to, you know, answering questions. You know, it was a little hard for me to like write this whole thing out because there was like so much to cover in so many ways. You know, just thinking about, I've talked about my trauma in different ways and in different times in little bits and pieces, but it's been a long time since I've actually talked about my trauma all together in, you know, succession. What inspired you to share this very important yet very difficult topic? Well, what inspired both me and Dia when we decided this year that we wanted to talk more about healing and BDSM and its intersection and healing through BDSM. It's just been a really important topic for us because we both have gone through our own journey, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. And so this year, as we talked about interviewing more people about this topic, we discussed me talking about my own story. And it's something that I really wanted to do, and I had been thinking about for the last 6 months. I just wasn't sure when and how I wanted to go about it because, you know, there was a lot, you know, it's a very vulnerable topic for me. It's not something I shy away from, but it's still extremely vulnerable. And as a dominatrix, you usually have to stay so strong. So, would you be open to talking about a particular client who you've gone on a healing journey with? You know, and if I would say, you know, I think most people already know, you know, pain pups. And, you know, I want to talk about a specific scene, actually, because, you know, I've guided pups through a lot of his own experience and through a lot of things he needed to work with, but my relationship with him has helped guide me a lot as well. And there was a specific moment that will be part of my memory for the rest of my life, but I was going through a really, really hard time. You know, family, relationships, like anything that could just sort of blow up was blowing up. And I think Pups was going through a lot of difficulty as well. And we had this end of year scene, and it was a scene that I wanted to do. I don't think we had necessarily talked about it ahead of time, that this is how it would go down. But we talked about like a whipping scene. And I remember having it all black and having this strobe light on and playing this very specific soundtrack, one that I had been listening to, this playlist that was very dark and emotional and deep. And, you know, Pups and I have a consensual non-consent relationship, and it was just said that we would just keep going, right? That I would whip him and we would just keep going. And it was so emotional for both of us. It was, one, he was processing and he was crying, and I was whipping him and I was processing and I was just crying. I was just letting so much like sadness and anger and passion and I was so upset at myself for different things, for, you know, different habits that I wasn't letting go, these, cycles that I was in. And it was one of the most cathartic experiences to have and hear him take this pain for me, to hear him cry and let go, and to feel that and also feel the same exact way, because even though I was the one applying the pain, I was feeling so much pain at the time that it was as if I was feeling every whip that I was hitting him, that I was feeling it myself. And it was the thing that I needed to let some really deep emotional baggage go. And those are some of those experiences that can happen in a scene and in a BDSM relationship that I just don't think happens in other types of interactions. And I'm thankful for that, I'm truly thankful to be able to have that sort of relationship with someone. I think there are a few other people that I've, definitely seen that, such as Big Baby G, that has, gone through a journey with us as well, to that this interaction, that BDSM has helped him feel loved and feel comforted and feel, he has moved through his own trauma with his own past, his own trauma with his own mother, and his own relationships with women, and to have his interaction with us to be in a safe place to express himself, to be able to be vulnerable, to be, in bondage and feel safe, to feel like he's back in the womb, to be with women who care for him and don't judge him for his trauma, I think is very healing as well. Is there anyone who might have a question? But, so if anyone does have a question, for those who have asked questions, thank you so much. For those of you guys who are listening, how do you help someone move through trauma and avoid reliving trauma? That is a very good question. I think it takes a lot of communication. I think it takes if we are reliving, I would say part of moving through trauma sometimes could be reliving trauma, but in a safe space. And that is through communication. That is through having this container where they know when it begins, ends, that they have control during it, so that they can stop it at any moment. But for me, I think the biggest thing is through communication, talking about why, talking about how they feel, why, how they feel, why they feel that way, what it means to them. And when I do a scene with someone who is maybe wanting to work through some of their trauma, it's something that I don't do initially with someone I don't know. It takes getting to know them, us having many conversations, us talking throughout the scene, us processing after the scene, immediately after, a few days after, and continuing to have that conversation so that we know that we're not reliving the trauma in this abusive cycle, and that, that they're actually moving through their trauma and getting a better hold and understanding of it, for me, is what I try to do. Every situation is very different. Every client is different, because I have had to say no to those who don't actually want to move through their trauma, but they just want to wallow in it and relive it in a negative way and repeat that cycle. And if I see that, I will be honest and say, this is what I'm seeing, and I don't think our relationship is healthy, and I don't think I can be a part of this interaction. And, those are my own, I guess, ethics in that, because there are people, and I know this myself, I was getting into relationships to relive my trauma in a negative way, and I wasn't moving past my trauma. I wasn't moving through it. I wasn't trying to understand it. I was wallowing in the pain and in the suffering and in the self-loathing. And I had to learn to stop being in those types of relationships. And I learned to stop being in those types of relationships through therapy, through my Buddhist studies, but also through BDSM. Through BDSM, because I was seeing other people who weren't moving through their trauma either, and recognizing when those things were happening and talking about them helped me see my own patterns and my own negative patterns as well. Hopefully that answered your question, Miss Blunt. Do I hold resentment for my father? That's a very interesting question. So, my father and I do not talk. And I made that choice because my father is someone who, again, is reliving his trauma and can't move past it. He doesn't seem to want to move past it for some reason. Maybe he feels safe in it, and it's no longer healthy for me to interact with him because he hasn't and refuses to move forward. And that's not healthy, and that's where, as individuals, we have to learn to put our own boundary up. And that's part of my own self-care, is putting that boundary with my father. He's my father, but I don't owe him anything, and he really doesn't owe me anything at this point. And I've learned to accept that. I've learned to really accept that. And so I don't resent him at all. Do I wish that he would move past his trauma and our mutual issues from my childhood? Yeah, I wish he would move forward, but he hasn't. And because of that, I've had to create that boundary, and that's why I haven't spoken to him. So my mother and I have a really good relationship, and we have a good relationship even though a lot of even though there was a lot of trauma that was based on my relationship with my mother has learned to move forward. She has made changes to her own behavior, how she interacts with me, how, I really believe people have the ability to change, and she's done that, and that is what helped mend our relationship. We didn't speak for a year, and when she realized she was going to lose me and she was going to lose my sister, she made the changes. She started and worked on making the changes she needed to be the type of mother we needed her to be, And for her, her relationship with us was, she valued and wanted that so deeply that she did the work necessary to make the changes she needed to do in herself. And that's not easy. And I respect her because for that, I respect her for the changes she made to move forward and be a better person and be a better mother. But also, you know, I respect her, you know, I also respect her because with time and with age, I've also learned that she was going through her own trauma. She was going through her own difficulties, you know, raising 2 kids, being a single mother, an immigrant mother who didn't speak English, and trying to create the best life she could for her kids. She was working hard to do that. And also, she wasn't raised in a community that talked about the shit that happened. I didn't learn about all the atrocities that happened to her during the Vietnam War until 2 years ago. We don't live in this community that the Vietnamese community and the Asian community don't talk about these things and don't talk about mental health. And so she was holding all of this inside and trying to survive. And so I've learned to have perspective in the fact that she did whatever she could to give her kids a better life. And there were mistakes made. You know, there were mistakes made, but they were mistakes that she's learned from. And that's the thing that also BDSM has taught me. Scenes are going to go wrong, boundaries are going to be crossed, mistakes are going to be made, but as long as we create this safe structure to be able to talk about it and to not blame each other, but to actually have a conversation, to process, to learn together, and to move forward, that is the best you can do. And that is something I actually didn't truly learn until I started my BDSM journey. And I realized that those were the things I needed to apply to my mother as well. If there is any other questions, please feel free to ask them. And like I said, no question, unless it's very disrespectful, is off limits. I really want it to be open. I want it to be vulnerable. I wanted to tell you my story in full, in a way that I don't think I've ever told. And I want it to be something that hopefully helps anyone out there going through similar things or is looking at their past and realizing that they went through similar experiences, and knowing that there is a way to move past and through those past traumas. If there isn't any more questions, I'm actually just going to close out and, you know, let you guys all know thank you for joining me, and for those who watch this afterwards, thank you for listening. I am actually taking a little Periscope hiatus in March to focus on some schooling, and so Miss Dia will actually be doing all the Periscopes for March. She'll be interviewing some wonderful individuals, so please look out for that every Monday. And I will be back in April to start, March, April, in April to, start doing interviews and having these conversations again. So please join us for the next few series throughout this year, talking about healing and BDSM and hearing about others' healing journey, just like myself. Have a great night, everyone. Bye.